Hello, YouTube Sidekick here. Before I start, I just want to say the experience of jumping in to the Savage Cub at 2,000 feet over Friday Harbor in virtual reality in Microsoft Flight Simulator was an event that was truly one of those moments that I will remember for a long time. Not like the birth of my children or my first shift in mission control or anything, but it was still a pretty powerful experience. This is partly because I have spent years jumping into Piper Cubs over Friday Harbor. It was my go-to starting position when I sat down to fly FSX for a few minutes for years. So the experience was familiar, but oh so not familiar. The thing you have to understand, and which you will if you've ever tried VR in a flight sim, is that the experience was not visual, it was physical. Or even visceral. I actually felt myself contained in the confined cockpit. I actually pulled my elbows in. I expected to see my hands in front of me. I expected to be able to touch the windscreen and the dashboard. More importantly, I felt myself to be flying. Like, really flying. In a way that I have not, even in VR in DCS, which is the other sim I fly a lot. The experience of sitting in that very basic Cub cockpit, where you really are sitting in the air, was just palpable. I was there. I was 2,000 feet in the air over the Pacific Ocean. For about 30 seconds, I just sat there and looked around, barely even flying the plane. I apologize for going on about it, but it really left a powerful impression on me. So I wanted to make a video about VR in Microsoft Flight Simulator, as a follow-up to the one that I did on VR in DCS a few months ago. I know a bit more about VR now than I did then. I'm still a novice at VR for sure, so this video is meant more for people who are thinking of trying VR than for folks who are already experts at it. I want to talk a little about the overall VR experience in flight simulation, which covers some of the ground I covered in the last video. I also want to talk a little bit about how Flight Simulator is different than DCS, and frankly why I think VR works a bit better in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I also want to talk a bit about performance issues based on what I have picked up over the last few months. Unfortunately, I can't give you my list of perfect parameter settings, but I can talk a little bit about the factors that affect performance and why evaluating performance in VR is not necessarily as easy as you might think. So first of all, is flying in VR different than flying in 2D? In a word, yep. I would argue that it's a very different experience. So different that I actually feel like I'm engaged in a completely different activity when I fly VR compared to when I fly in 2D. And VR is so much more immersive, so much more of a full-body experience that it actually feels a bit like leaving the house when I do it. Really, I don't feel like I'm sitting at my desk and looking at the bookcase. I feel like I'm sitting in a Piper Cub looking over the edge of the cockpit. The third dimension makes a huge difference in a number of ways in a flight sim. It makes any task of alignment on a runway or a target in DCS much easier. It also adds physical sensation to acceleration and deceleration and makes flying by sensation more possible. The immersive nature fools your vestibular system into actually feeling sensations you don't actually feel. In a sense, normal 2D flying in a simulator is always kind of instrument flying because you are interpreting two-dimensional visual cues and turning them into 3D information in your head. In VR, you can actually fly VFR because you get the 3D cues directly into your brain without that level of interpretation. But the thing about VR, because it's so much more immersive, it does feel like it takes more effort. It feels like going away. So it's something that I'm much less likely to do when I only have a few minutes to fly. Likewise, I actually do find it more tiring in a way, and I am less likely to spend a whole evening flying in VR, whereas I often do that in 2D. And finally, the thing about VR is that it's still not an ideal interface for interfacing with the computer and with the flight sim program. Planning or editing missions, changing control schemes, setting options are not optimal in VR, although they're better in Flight Simulator than they are in DCS. And while I can't interact with my desktop in VR, again, it's not ideal. So if I'm working on a project that requires a lot of editing or interaction with the desktop, to use other apps or to save or process videos or that sort of thing, I tend to stay in 2D. When I just want to enjoy the thrill of flying, I go VR every time. So why do I like the Microsoft Flight Simulator integration of VR better than DCS? Well, the main reason is the flexibility of how it's implemented. In DCS, to work in VR, you have to restart the sim in VR mode. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can switch on the fly, literally, with a keystroke or a button press. This is very useful because it means that you can do all the setup and editing in desktop mode before putting on the headset and pressing a button to suddenly be in VR. The menu system is much easier to access in Flight Simulator as well, and much better suited to VR, and this is probably because it was also designed to work with a console. But it means that the resolution of the dialog boxes and the menus are much more compatible with a VR headset. And Microsoft Flight Simulator also supports real-time changes to graphics settings, which means that in-game you can actually make changes to the VR settings and assess their impact. And this is actually a huge benefit. And to understand why, you need to understand a bit about VR and how it's different than 2D video. And these are things that I have just ascertained by working with it over the last few months. And first of all, a quick disclaimer. What I'm about to say, I think, is true of my Oculus Quest 2. I don't know if it's different for other VR headsets, so take it with that grain of salt. The first thing to know is that the VR screen resolution is, effectively, double the resolution that you see specified, because VR has to draw 2 independent images at that resolution. So this means that the higher resolutions in VR will rapidly stretch your GPU and CPU, and why a fairly high-end machine is necessary for a good VR experience, because you need high resolution in each of your eyeballs in VR. Secondly, you need to understand something about frame rates. We are used to using frame rate as a measure of how well your computer is keeping up with the demands of the game. If FPS gets too low, the sim starts to get jerky or lag your inputs, and it gets much harder to fly, and we can quantify that by looking at the frame rate. So your first impulse will be to try different settings in VR and compare the frame rates to see which settings affect your results. But here's the thing. My Quest 2 headset forces the frame rate to be 72 Hz or 90 Hz. I can choose which one. This means that even though I do not have VSync enabled, it will force the frame rate to be some even factor of those frame rates. In other words, if my hardware can do 72 Hz, I'll get 72 Hz, which I never get. Otherwise, it will step down to 36 Hz. If it can't do 36 Hz, it will do 18. So changes that do not affect the FPS by a multiple of the frame rate don't show up in the FPS statistic. Instead, they show up in more subtle ways. There seem to be a variety of ways that the system will compensate, including smearing, tearing, and stuttering. And you can see why all of these strategies would reduce the bit rate needed to refresh a frame. Smearing reduces the resolution in certain parts of the scene. Tearing, I assume, occurs when only part of the scene is being refreshed every frame, and stuttering probably stems from delaying a refresh by more than one cycle until all of the data has been assembled. But here's the thing. Evaluating the effect of those strategies is pretty subjective and qualitative, and that's why the ability to test them while in-game is so valuable. If there was some reliable quantitative measure of quality, like FPS, then just running a standard scene with a bunch of different parameter sets would be the best way to determine what works best and what has most effect on the quality. But we don't have that. You can tweak parameters all day on my machine, and it will tell you that the CPU is basically maxed out, the GPU is near its peak, and the frame rate is 36 frames per second. Nothing that I do changes any of those things very much. So instead, to evaluate the effect of the changes, I have to actually fly the sim and experience it, and then make a change and evaluate the effect on my experience. Yes, it's subjective, and I'm sure that my experience may differ from others, but at least it's possible for me to do a subjective comparison of what happens when I change the parameters. In DCS, since I have to end the current flight, make the changes, and possibly, depending on the change, restart the sim, it's much more difficult to do this kind of subjective analysis. Finally, it's just me, and it's very subjective, but I find the way that Microsoft Flight Simulator deals with performance issues are less disruptive to my general well-being than the way DCS does it. I don't know exactly why. I think it's because DCS relies a lot more on stuttering, and Microsoft relies more on smearing and tearing, which, for whatever reason, is less nausea-inducing to me. But again, that's a personal thing. So, which parameter setting should you use? Well, it's really something I think you have to test for yourself. The one thing I can say is that anything that increases resolution, like super sampling, or anything that adds significant detail, like terrain or object detail, seems to have more of a dramatic effect than things like anti-aliasing and other filter parameters. So I tend to fly with those filters on at some kind of mid-level, but with the level of detail turned down below, honestly, what I'd like it to be. That's about as much help as I can really be. I think you really need to test for yourself, but thankfully in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it isn't hard to do that testing and see what suits you. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you're looking for conclusions, the big one is that if you haven't tried VR in a flight sim and you have a machine that'll support it, you really should. It's an experience really like no other that you can have sitting in your office chair. That being said, flying VR is quite different than flying in 2D, and not necessarily the way you will always want to fly. I like flying in VR in both DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I find that it's easier to fly in VR in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I tend to choose it more often than I do in DCS. And that's all for now. And this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.